Section 6 of The Chorus Girl and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tavarish. The Chorus Girl and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett. My Life, the Story of a Provincial, Part 4. 2 days later she sent me to Dubechnya, and I was unutterably delighted to go. As I walked towards the station and afterwards, as I was sitting in the train, I kept laughing from no apparent cause, and people looked at me as though I were drunk. Snow was falling, and there were still frosts in the mornings, but the roads were already dark-coloured, and rooks hovered over them, cawing. At first I had intended to fit up an abode for us two, Masha and me, in the lodge at the side opposite Madame Tcheprakov's lodge, but it appeared that the doves and the ducks had been living there for a long time, and it was impossible to clean it without destroying a great number of nests. There was nothing for it but to live in the comfortless rooms of the big house with the sunblinds. The peasants called the house the palace. There were more than 20 rooms in it, and the only furniture was a piano and a child's armchair lying in the attic. And if Masha had brought all her furniture from the town, we should even then have been unable to get rid of the impression of immense emptiness and cold. I picked out 3 small rooms with windows looking into the garden, and worked from early morning till night setting them to rights, putting in new panes, papering the walls, filling up the holes and chinks in the floors. It was easy, pleasant work. I was continually running to the river to see whether the ice were not going. I kept fancying that starlings were flying. And at night, thinking of Masha, I listened with an unutterably sweet feeling, with clutching delight, to the noise of the rats and the wind droning and knocking above the ceiling. It seemed as though some old house spirit were coughing in the attic. The snow was deep. A great deal had fallen even at the end of March, but it melted quickly, as though by magic, and the spring floods passed in a tumultuous rush, so that by the beginning of April the starlings were already noisy, and yellow butterflies were flying in the garden. It was exquisite weather. Every day towards evening I used to walk to the town to meet Masha, and what a delight it was to walk with bare feet along the gradually drying, still soft road. Half-way I used to sit down and look towards the town, not venturing to go near it. The sight of it troubled me. I kept wondering how the people I knew would behave to me when they heard of my love. What would my father say? What troubled me particularly was the thought that my life was more complicated, and that I had completely lost all power to set it right, and that, like a balloon, it was bearing me away, God knows whither. I no longer considered the problem how to earn my daily bread, how to live, but thought about I really don't know what. Masha used to come in a carriage. I used to get in with her, and we drove to Dubechnya feeling light-hearted and free. Or, after waiting till the sun had set, I would go back dissatisfied and dreary, wondering why Masha had not come. At the gate or in the garden I would be met by a sweet, unexpected apparition. It was she. It would turn out that she had come by rail, and had walked from the station. What a festival it was! In a simple woolen dress, with a kerchief on her head, with a modest sunshade, but laced in, slender, inexpensive foreign boots, it was a talented actress playing the part of a little work girl. We looked round our domain and decided which should be her room and which mine, where we would have our avenue, our kitchen garden, our beehives. We already had hens, ducks, and geese, which we loved because they were ours. We had, all ready for sowing, oats, clover, timothy grass, buckwheat, and vegetable seeds, and we always looked at all these stores and discussed at length the crop we might get, and everything Masha said to me seemed extraordinarily clever and fine. This was the happiest time of my life. Soon after St. Thomas's week we were married at our parish church in the village of Kurilovka, 2 miles from Dubetchnya. Masha wanted everything to be done quietly. At her wish our best men were peasant lads. The sacristan sang alone, and we came back from the church in a small jolting chaise which she drove herself. Our only guest from the town was my sister Kleopatra, to whom Masha sent a note 3 days before the wedding. My sister came in a white dress and wore gloves. During the wedding she cried quietly from joy and tenderness. Her expression was motherly and infinitely kind. She was intoxicated with our happiness and smiled as though she were absorbing a sweet delirium. And looking at her during our wedding I realized that for her there was nothing in the world higher than love, earthly love, and that she was dreaming of it secretly, timidly, but continually and passionately. She embraced and kissed Masha, and not knowing how to express her rapture, said to her of me, "He is good, he is very good." Before she went away she changed into her ordinary dress and drew me into the garden to talk to me alone. "Father is very much hurt," she said, "that you have written nothing to him. You ought to have asked for his blessing. But in reality he is very much pleased. He says that this marriage will raise you in the eyes of all society, and that under the influence of Maria Viktorovna you will begin to take a more serious view of life. We talk of nothing but you in the evenings now, and yesterday he actually used the expression 'our Misail,' that pleased me. It seemed as though he had some plan in his mind, and I fancy he wants to set you an example of magnanimity and be the first to speak of reconciliation. It is very possible he may come here to see you in a day or two." She hurriedly made the sign of the cross over me several times and said, "Well, God be with you, be happy. Anyuta Blagovo is a very clever girl. She says about your marriage that God is sending you a fresh ordeal. To be sure, married life does not bring you only joy, but suffering too. That's bound to be so." Masha and I walked a couple of miles to see her on her way. We walked back slowly and in silence, as though we were resting. Masha held my hand, my heart felt light, and I had no inclination to talk about love. We had become closer and more akin now that we were married, and we felt that nothing now could separate us. "Your sister is a nice creature," said Masha, "but it seems as though she had been tormented for years. Your father must be a terrible man." I began telling her how my sister and I had been brought up, and what a senseless torture our childhood had really been. When she heard how my father had so lately beaten me, she shuddered and drew closer to me. "Don't tell me any more," she said. "It's horrible." Now she never left me. We lived together in the 3 rooms in the big house, and in the evenings we bolted the door which led to the empty part of the house, as though someone were living there whom we did not know and were afraid of. I got up early, at dawn, and immediately set to work of some sort. I mended the carts, made paths in the garden, dug the flower beds, painted the roof of the house. When the time came to sow the oats, I tried to plough the ground over again, to harrow and to sow, and I did it all conscientiously, keeping up with our labourer. I was worn out. The rain and the cold wind made my face and feet burn for hours afterwards. I dreamed of ploughed land at night, but field labour did not attract me. I did not understand farming, and I did not care for it. It was perhaps because my forefathers had not been tillers of the soil, and the very blood that flowed in my veins was purely of the city. I loved nature tenderly, I loved the fields and meadows and kitchen gardens, but the peasant who turned up the soil with his plough and urged on his pitiful horse, wet and tattered, with his craning neck, was to me the expression of coarse, savage, ugly force, and every time I looked at his uncouth movements I involuntarily began thinking of the legendary life of the remote past, before men knew the use of fire. The fierce bull that ran with the peasant's herd, and the horses when they dashed about the village stamping their hoofs, moved me to fear, and everything rather big, strong, and angry, whether it was the ram with its horns, the gander, or the yard dog, seemed to me the expression of the same coarse, savage force. This mood was particularly strong in me in bad weather, when heavy clouds were hanging over the black ploughed land. Above all, when I was ploughing or sowing, and 2 or 3 people stood looking how I was doing it, I had not the feeling that this work was inevitable and obligatory, and it seemed to me that I was amusing myself. I preferred doing something in the yard, and there was nothing I liked so much as painting the roof. I used to walk through the garden and the meadow to our mill. It was let to a peasant of Kurilovka called Stepan, a handsome, dark fellow with a thick black beard, who looked very strong. He did not like the miller's work and looked upon it as dreary and unprofitable, and only lived at the mill in order not to live at home. He was a leather worker, and was always surrounded by a pleasant smell of tar and leather. He was not fond of talking, he was listless and sluggish, and was always sitting in the doorway or on the river bank, humming "oo-loo-loo." His wife and mother-in-law, both white-faced, languid, and meek, used sometimes to come from Kurilovka to see him. They made low bows to him and addressed him formally, Stepan Petrovitch, while he went on sitting on the river bank, softly humming "oo-loo-loo," without responding by word or movement to their bows. 1 hour and then a second would pass in silence. His mother-in-law and wife, after whispering together, would get up and gaze at him for some time, expecting him to look round, then they would make a low bow, and in a sugary, chanting voices say, "Good-bye, Stepan Petrovitch," and they would go away. After that Stepan, picking up the parcel they had left, containing cracknels or a shirt, would heave a sigh and say, winking in their direction, "The female sex." The mill, with 2 sets of millstones, worked day and night. I used to help Stepan. I liked the work, and when he went off I was glad to stay and take his place. After bright warm weather came a spell of wet. All May it rained and was cold. The sound of the mill wheels and of the rain disposed one to indolence and slumber. The floor trembled, there was a smell of flour, and that too induced drowsiness. My wife, in a short fur-lined jacket and in men's high golosh boots, would make her appearance twice a day, and she always said the same thing: "And this is called summer! Worse than it was in October!" We used to have tea and make the porridge together, or we would sit for hours at a stretch without speaking, waiting for the rain to stop. Once, when Stepan had gone off to the fair, Masha stayed all night at the mill. When we got up we could not tell what time it was, and the rain clouds covered the whole sky, but sleepy cocks were crowing at Dubetchnya and landrails were calling in the meadows. It was still very, very early. My wife and I went down to the mill pond and drew out the net which Stepan had brought in overnight in our presence. A big pike was struggling in it, and a crawfish was twisting about, clawing upwards with its pincers. "Let them go," said Masha. "Let them be happy too." Because we got up so early and afterwards did nothing, that day seemed very long, the longest day in my life. Towards evening Stepan came back and I went home. "Your father came today," said Masha. "Where is he?" I asked. "He has gone away. I would not see him." Seeing that I remained standing and silent, that I was sorry for my father, she said: "One must be consistent. I would not see him, and sent word to him not to trouble to come and see us again." A minute later I was out at the gate and walking to the town to explain things to my father. It was muddy, slippery, cold. For the first time since my marriage I felt suddenly sad, and in my brain, exhausted by that long grey day, there was stirring the thought that perhaps I was not living as I ought. I was worn out. Little by little I was overcome by despondency and indolence. I did not want to move or think, and after going on a little I gave it up with a wave of my hand and turned back. The engineer in a leather overcoat with a hood was standing in the middle of the yard. "Where is the furniture? There used to be lovely furniture in the Empire style. There used to be pictures, there used to be vases, while now you could play ball in it. I bought the place with the furniture, the devil take her!" Moisey, a thin, pock-marked fellow of 25, with insolent little eyes, who was in the service of the general's widow, stood near him crumpling up his cap in his hands. One of his cheeks was bigger than the other, as though he had lain too long on it. "Your honour was graciously pleased to buy the place without the furniture," he brought in irresolutely. "I remember." "Hold your tongue!" shouted the engineer. He turned crimson and shook with anger, and the echo in the garden loudly repeated his shout. When I was doing anything in the garden or the yard, Moisey would stand beside me, and folding his arms behind his back he would stand lazily and impudently staring at me with his little eyes. And this irritated me to such a degree that I threw up my work and went away. From Stepan we heard that Moisey was Madame Tcheprakov's lover. I noticed that when people came to her to borrow money they addressed themselves first to Moisey, and once I saw a peasant, black from head to foot, he must have been a coal heaver, bow down at Moisey's feet. Sometimes, after a little whispering, he gave out money himself without consulting his mistress, from which I concluded that he did a little business on his own account. He used to shoot in our garden under our windows, carried off victuals from our cellar, borrowed our horses without asking permission, and we were indignant and began to feel as though Dubetchnya were not ours, and Masha would say, turning pale: "Can we really have to go on living with these reptiles another 18 months?" Madame Tcheprakov's son, Ivan, was serving as a guard on our railway line. He had grown much thinner and feebler during the winter, so that a single glass was enough to make him drunk, and he shivered out of the sunshine. He wore the guard's uniform with aversion and was ashamed of it, but considered his post a good one, as he could steal the candles and sell them. My new position excited in him a mixed feeling of wonder envy, and a vague hope that something of the same sort might happen to him. He used to watch Masha with ecstatic eyes, ask me what I had for dinner now, and his lean and ugly face wore a sad and sweetish expression, and he moved his fingers as though he were feeling my happiness with them. "Listen, better than nothing," he said fussily, relighting his cigarette at every instant. There was always a litter where he stood, for he wasted dozens of matches lighting one cigarette. "Listen, my life now is the nastiest possible. The worst of it is any subaltern could shout, 'Hi there, guard!' I have overheard all sorts of things in the train, my boy, and do you know I have learned that life's a beastly thing. My mother has been the ruin of me. A doctor in the train told me that if parents are immoral, their children are drunkards or criminals. Think of that!" Once he came into the yard staggering, his eyes gazed about blankly, his breathing was laboured, he laughed and cried and babbled as though in a high fever, and the only words I could catch in his muddled talk were, "My mother! Where is my mother?" which he uttered with a wail, like a child who has lost his mother in a crowd. I led him into our garden and laid him down under a tree, and Masha and I took turns to sit by him all that day and all night. He was very sick, and Masha looked with aversion at his pale, wet face, and said, "Is it possible these reptiles will go on living another year and a half in our yard? It's awful, it's awful!" And how many mortifications the peasants caused us! How many bitter disappointments in those early days in the spring months when we so longed to be happy! My wife built a school. I drew a plan of a school for 60 boys, and the Zemstvo board approved of it, but advised us to build the school at Kurilovka, the big village, which was only 2 miles from us. Moreover, the school at Kurilovka, in which children from 4 villages, our Dubitchnya being one of the number, were taught, was old and too small, and the floor was scarcely safe to walk upon. At the end of March, at Masha's wish, she was appointed guardian of the Kurilovka school, and at the beginning of April we 3 times summoned the village assembly and tried to persuade the peasants that their school was old and overcrowded, and that it was essential to build a new one. A member of the Zemstvo board and the inspector of peasant schools came, and they too tried to persuade them. After each meeting the peasants surrounded us, begging for a bucket of vodka. We were hot in the crowd. We were soon exhausted and returned home dissatisfied and a little ill at ease. In the end the peasants set apart a plot of ground for the school, and were obliged to bring all the building material from the town with their own horses. And the very first Sunday, after the spring corn was sown, carts set off from Kurilovka and Dubetchnya to fetch bricks for the foundations. They set off as soon as it was light, and came back late in the evening. The peasants were drunk, and said they were worn out. As ill luck would have it, the rain and the cold persisted all through May. The road was in an awful state, it was deep in mud. The carts usually drove into our yard when they came back from the town, and what a horrible ordeal it was! A pot-bellied horse would appear at the gate, setting its front legs wide apart. It would stumble forward before coming into the yard. A beam 9 yards long, wet and slimy looking, crept in on a wagon. Beside it, muffled up against the rain, strode a peasant with the skirts of his coat tucked up in his belt, not looking where he was going, but stepping through the puddles. Another cart would appear with boards, then a third with a beam, a fourth. and the space before our house was gradually crowded up with horses, beams, and planks. Men and women with their heads muffled and their skirts tucked up would stare angrily at our windows, make an uproar and clamour for the mistress to come out to them. Coarse oaths were audible. Meanwhile Moisey stood at one side, and we fancied he was enjoying our discomfiture. "We are not going to cart any more," the peasants would shout. "We are worn out. Let her go and get the stuff herself." Masha, pale and flustered, expecting every minute that they would break into the house, would send them out a half pail of vodka. After that the noise would subside, and the long beams, one after another, would crawl slowly out of the yard. When I was setting off to see the building my wife was worried, and said, "The peasants are spiteful. I only hope they won't do you a mischief. Wait a minute, I'll come with you." We drove to Kurilovka together, and there the carpenters asked us for a drink. The framework of the house was ready. It was time to lay the foundation, but the masons had not come. This caused delay, and the carpenters complained. And when at last the masons did come, it appeared that there was no sand. It had been somehow overlooked that it would be needed. Taking advantage of our helpless position, the peasants demanded 30 kopecks for each cartload, though the distance from the building to the river where they got the sand was less than a quarter of a mile, and more than 500 cartloads were found to be necessary. There was no end to the misunderstandings, swearing, and importunity. My wife was indignant, and the foreman of the masons, Tit Petrov, an old man of 70, took her by the arm and said: "You look here, you only bring me the sand. I set 10 men on at once, and in 2 days it will be done. You look here." But they brought the sand, and 2 days passed, and 4, and a week, and instead of the promised foundations there was still a yawning hole. "It's enough to drive one out of one's senses," said my wife in distress. "What people, what people!" In the midst of these disorderly doings the engineer arrived. He brought with him parcels of wine and savouries, and after a prolonged meal lay down for a nap in the veranda and snored so loudly that the labourers shook their heads and said, "Well." Masha was not pleased at his coming. She did not trust him, though at the same time she asked his advice. When, after sleeping too long after dinner, he got up in a bad humour and said unpleasant things about our management of the place, or expressed regret that he had bought Dubetchnya, which had already been a loss to him, poor Masha's face wore an expression of misery. She would complain to him, and he would yawn and say that the peasants ought to be flogged. He called our marriage and our life a farce, and said it was a caprice, a whim. "She has done something of the sort before," he said about Masha. "She once fancied herself a great opera singer and left me. I was looking for her for 2 months, and, my dear soul, I spent 1,000 roubles on telegrams alone." He no longer called me a dissenter or Mr. Painter, and did not, as in the past, express approval of my living like a workman, but said: "You are a strange person. You are not a normal person. I won't venture to prophesy, but you will come to a bad end." And Masha slept badly at night, and was always sitting at our bedroom window thinking. There was no laughter at supper now, no charming grimaces. I was wretched, and when it rained every drop that fell seemed to pierce my heart like small shot, and I felt ready to fall on my knees before Masha and apologize for the weather. When the peasants made a noise in the yard I felt guilty also. For hours at a time I sat still in one place, thinking of nothing but what a splendid person Masha was, what a wonderful person. I loved her passionately, and I was fascinated by everything she did, everything she said. She had a bent for quiet, studious pursuits. She was fond of reading for hours together, of studying. Although her knowledge of farming was only from books, she surprised us all by what she knew, and every piece of advice she gave was of value. Not one was ever thrown away, and, with all that, what nobility, what taste, what graciousness, that graciousness which is only found in well-educated people. To this woman, with her sound, practical intelligence, the disorderly surroundings with petty cares and sordid anxieties in which we were living now were an agony. I saw that and could not sleep at night. My brain worked feverishly and I had a lump in my throat. I rushed about, not knowing what to do. I galloped to the town and brought Masha books, newspapers, sweets, flowers. With Stepan I caught fish, wading for hours up to my neck in the cold water in the rain to catch eel pout, to vary our fare. I demeaned myself to beg the peasants not to make a noise. I plied them with vodka, bought them off, made all sorts of promises, and how many other foolish things I did. At last the rain ceased, the earth dried. One would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, one would go out into the garden where there was dew sparkling on the flowers, the twitter of birds, the hum of insects, not one cloud in the sky, and the garden, the meadows, and the river were so lovely, yet there were memories of the peasants, of their carts, of the engineer. Masha and I drove out together in the racing droshky to the fields to look at the oats. She used to drive, I sat behind, her shoulders were raised and the wind played with her hair. "Keep to the right!" she shouted to those she met. "You are like a sledge driver," I said to her one day. "Maybe. Why, my grandfather, the engineer's father, was a sledge driver. Didn't you know that?" she asked, turning to me, and at once she mimicked the way sledge drivers shout and sing. And thank God for that, I thought as I listened to her. Thank God. And again memories of the peasants, of the carts, of the engineer. Dr. Blagovo arrived on his bicycle. My sister began coming often. Again there were conversations about manual labor, about progress, about a mysterious millennium awaiting mankind in the remote future. The doctor did not like our farm work because it interfered with arguments, and said that ploughing, reaping, grazing calves were unworthy of a free man, and all these coarse forms of the struggle for existence men would in time relegate to animals and machines, while they would devote themselves exclusively to scientific investigation. My sister kept begging them to let her go home earlier, and if she stayed on till late in the evening or spent the night with us, there would be no end to the agitation. "Good heavens, what a baby you are still!" said Masha reproachfully. "It is positively absurd." "Yes, it is absurd," my sister agreed. "I know it's absurd, but what is to be done if I haven't the strength to get over it? I keep feeling as though I were doing wrong." At haymaking I ached all over from the unaccustomed labour. In the evening, sitting on the veranda and talking with the others, I suddenly dropped asleep, and they laughed aloud at me. They waked me up and made me sit down to supper. I was overpowered with drowsiness, and I saw the lights, the faces, and the plates as it were in a dream, heard the voices but did not understand them. and getting up early in the morning I took up the scythe at once, or went to the building and worked hard all day. When I remained at home on holidays I noticed that my sister and Masha were concealing something from me, and even seemed to be avoiding me. My wife was tender to me as before, but she had thoughts of her own apart, which she did not share with me. There was no doubt that her exasperation with the peasants was growing. Their life was becoming more and more distasteful to her, and yet she did not complain to me. She talked to the doctor now more readily than she did to me, and I did not understand why it was so. It was the custom in our province at haymaking and harvest time for the labourers to come to the manor house in the evening and be regaled with vodka. Even young girls drank a glass. We did not keep up this practice. The mowers and the peasant women stood about in our yard till late in the evening expecting vodka, and then departed abusing us. And all the time Masha frowned grimly and said nothing, or murmured to the doctor with exasperation, "Savages, pichinnigs." In the country newcomers are met ungraciously, almost with hostility, as they are at school, and we were received in this way. At first we were looked upon as stupid, silly people, who had bought an estate simply because we did not know what to do with our money. We were laughed at. The peasants grazed their cattle in our wood, and even in our garden. They drove away our cows and horses to the village, and then demanded money for the damage done by them. They came in whole companies into our yard and loudly clamoured that at the mowing we had cut some piece of land that did not belong to us. And as we did not yet know the boundaries of our estate very accurately, we took their word for it and paid damages. Afterwards it turned out that there had been no mistake at the mowing. They barked the lime trees in our wood. One of the Dubetchnya peasants, a regular shark, who did a trade in vodka without a license, bribed our labourers and, in collaboration with them, cheated us in a most treacherous way. They took the new wheels off our carts and replaced them with old ones, stole our ploughing harness and actually sold them back to us, and so on. But what was most mortifying of all was what happened at the building. The peasant women stole by night boards, bricks, tiles, pieces of iron. The village elder, with witnesses, made a search in their huts. The village meeting fined them 2 roubles each, and afterwards this money was spent on drink by the whole commune. When Masha heard about this, she would say to the doctor or my sister indignantly, "What beasts! It's awful, awful!" And I heard her more than once express regret that she had ever taken it into her heart to build the school. "You must understand," the doctor tried to persuade her, "that if you build this school and do good in general, it's not for the sake of the peasants, but in the name of culture, in the name of the future. And the worse the peasants are, the more reason for building the school. Understand that." But there was a lack of conviction in his voice, and it seemed to me that both he and Masha hated the peasants. Masha often went to the mill, taking my sister with her, and they both said, laughing, that they went to have a look at Stepan. He was so handsome. Stepan, it appeared, was torpid and taciturn only with men. In feminine society his manners were free and easy, and he talked incessantly. One day, going down to the river to bathe, I accidentally overheard a conversation. Masha and Kleopatra, both in white dresses, were sitting on the bank in the spreading shade of a willow, and Stepan was standing by them with his hands behind his back, and was saying, "Are peasants men? They are not men, but, asking your pardon, wild beasts, impostors. What life has a peasant? Nothing but eating and drinking. All he cares for is victuals to keep cheaper and swilling liquor at the tavern like a fool. And there's no conversation, no manners, no formality, nothing but ignorance. He lives in filth, his wife lives in filth, and his children live in filth. What he stands up in, he lies down to sleep in. He picks the potatoes out of the soup with his fingers. He drinks kvass with a cockroach in it and doesn't bother to blow it away. "It's their poverty, of course," my sister put in. "Poverty? There is want, to be sure. There's different sorts of want, madam. If a man is in prison, or let us say blind or crippled, that really is trouble I wouldn't wish anyone. But if a man's free and has all his senses, if he has his eyes and his hands and his strength and God, what more does he want? It's cockering themselves, and it's ignorance, madam. It's not poverty. If you, let us suppose, good gentlefolk, by your education wish out of kindness to help him, he will drink away your money in his low way, or, what's worse, he will open a drink shop and with your money start robbing the people. You say poverty, but does the rich peasant live better? He too, asking your pardon, lives like a swine, coarse, loud-mouthed, cudgel-headed, broader than his long, fat, red-faced mug. I'd like to swing my fist and send him flying, the scoundrel. There is Larion, another rich one at Dubetchnya, and I bet he strips the bark off your trees as much as any poor one, and he is a foul-mouthed fellow. His children are the same, and when he has had a drop too much, he'll topple with his nose in a puddle and sleep there. They are all a worthless lot, madam. If you live in a village with them, it is like hell. It has stuck in my teeth, that village has, and thank the Lord, the King of Heaven, I've plenty to eat and clothes to wear. I served out my time in the dragoons, I was village elder for 3 years, and now I am a free Cossack. I live where I like. I don't want to live in the village, and no one has the right to force me. They say, my wife, they say you are bound to live in your village with your wife. But why so? I'm not her hired man." "Tell me, Stepan, did you marry for love?" asked Masha. "Love among us in the village," answered Stepan, and he gave a laugh. "Properly speaking, madam, if you care to know, this is my second marriage. I am not a Kurilovka man, I am from Zalegoshtcho, but afterwards I was taken into Kurilovka when I married. You see, my father did not want to divide the land among us. There were 5 of us brothers. I took my leave and went to another village to live with my wife's family. But my first wife died when she was young." "What did she die of?" "Of foolishness. She used to cry and cry and cry for no reason, and so she pined away. She was always drinking some sort of herbs to make her better looking, and I suppose she damaged her inside. And my second wife is a Kurilovka woman too. There is nothing in her. She is a village woman, a peasant woman, and nothing more. I was taken in when they plighted me to her. I thought she was young and fair-skinned, and that they lived in a clean way. Her mother was just like a flagellant, and she drank coffee, and the chief thing, to be sure, they were clean in their ways. So I married her, and next day we sat down to dinner. I bade my mother-in-law give me a spoon, and she gives me a spoon, and I see her wipe it out with her finger. So much for you, thought I. Nice sort of cleanliness yours is. I lived a year with them, and then I went away. I might have married a girl from the town," he went after a pause. "They say a wife is a helpmate to her husband. What do I want with a helpmate? I help myself. I'd rather she talked to me, and not clack, 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 but circumstantially, feelingly. What is life without good conversation?" Stepan suddenly paused, and at once there was the sound of his dreary, monotonous "oo-loo-loo-loo." This meant that he had seen me. Masha used often to go to the mill, and evidently found pleasure in her conversations with Stepan. Stepan abused the peasants with such sincerity and conviction, and she was attracted to him. Every time she came back from the mill the feeble-minded peasant who looked after the garden shouted at her, "Wench Palashka! Holla, wench Palashka!" and he would bark like a dog, "Gaw, gaw!" and she would stop and look at him attentively, as though in that idiot's barking she found an answer to her thoughts, and probably he attracted her in the same way as Stepan's abuse. At home some piece of news would await her, such for instance as that the geese from the village had ruined our cabbage in the garden, or that Larion had stolen the reins, and shrugging her shoulders she would say with a laugh, "What do you expect of these people?" She was indignant, and there was rancour in her heart, and meanwhile I was growing used to the peasants, and I felt more and more drawn to them. For the most part they were nervous, irritable, downtrodden people. They were people whose imagination had been stifled, ignorant, with a poor, dingy outlook on life, whose thoughts were ever the same, of the grey earth, of grey days, of black bread, people who cheated, but like birds hiding nothing but their head behind the tree, people who could not count. They would not come to mow for us for 20 roubles, but they came for half a pail of vodka, though for 20 roubles they could have bought 4 pails. There really was filth and drunkenness and foolishness and deceit, but with all that one yet felt that the life of the peasants rested on a firm, sound foundation. However uncouth a wild animal the peasant following the plough seemed, and however he might stupefy himself with vodka, still, looking at him more closely, one felt that there was in him what was needed, something very important, which was lacking in Masha and in the doctor, for instance, and that was that he believed the chief thing on earth was truth and justice, and that his salvation and that of the whole people was only to be found in truth and justice, and so more than anything in the world he loved just dealing. I told my wife she saw the spots on the glass, but not the glass itself. She said nothing in reply, or hummed like Stepan, "oo-loo-loo-loo." When this good-hearted and clever woman turned pale with indignation, and with a quiver in her voice spoke to the doctor of the drunkenness and dishonesty, it perplexed me, and I was struck by the shortness of her memory. How could she forget that her father, the engineer, drank too, and drank heavily, and that the money with which Dubetchnya had been bought had been acquired by a whole series of shameless, impudent dishonesties? How could she forget it? End of section 6. Section 7 of The Chorus Girl and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tavarish. The Chorus Girl and Other Stories by Anton Chekhov. Translated by Constance Garnett. My Life. The Story of a Provincial. Part 5. My sister too was leading a life of her own, which she carefully hid from me. She was often whispering with Masha. When I went up to her she seemed to shrink into herself, and there was a guilty, imploring look in her eyes, Evidently there was something going on in her heart of which she was afraid or ashamed. So as to avoid meeting me in the garden or being left alone with me, she always kept close to Masha, and I rarely had an opportunity of talking to her except at dinner. One evening I was walking quietly through the garden on my way back from the building. It was beginning to get dark. Without noticing me or hearing my step, my sister was walking near a spreading old apple tree, absolutely noiselessly, as though she were a phantom. She was dressed in black, and was walking rapidly backwards and forwards on the same track, looking at the ground. An apple fell from the tree. She started at the sound, stood still, and pressed her hands to her temples. At that moment I went up to her. In a rush of tender affection which suddenly flooded my heart, with tears in my eyes, suddenly remembering my mother and our childhood, I put my arm round her shoulders and kissed her. "What is the matter?" I asked her. "You are unhappy. I have seen it for a long time. Tell me what's wrong." "I am frightened," she said, trembling. "What is it?" I insisted. "For God's sake, be open." I will be open. I will tell you the whole truth. To hide it from you is so hard, so agonizing. Misail, I love," she went on in a whisper, "I love him, I love him. I'm happy, but why am I so frightened?" There was the sound of footsteps. Between the trees appeared Dr. Blagovo in his silk shirt with his high-top boots. Evidently they had arranged to meet near the apple tree. Seeing him, she rushed impulsively towards him with a cry of pain, as though he were being taken from her. "Vladimir, Vladimir!" She clung to him and looked greedily into his face, and only then I noticed how pale and thin she had become of late. It was particularly noticeable from her lace collar, which I had known for so long, and which now hung more loosely than ever before about her thin, long neck. The doctor was disconcerted, but at once recovered himself, and, stroking her hair, said: "There, there, why so nervous? You see I'm here." We were silent, looking with embarrassment at each other. Then we walked on, the three of us together, and I heard the doctor say to me: "Civilized life has not yet begun among us. Old men console themselves by making out that if there is nothing now, there was something in the 40s or the 60s. That's the old. You and I are young. Our brains have not yet been touched by marasmus senilis. We cannot comfort ourselves with such illusions. The beginning of Russia was in 862, but the beginning of civilized Russia has not come yet." But I did not grasp the meaning of these reflections. It was somehow strange, I could not believe it, that my sister was in love, that she was walking and holding the arm of a stranger and looking tenderly at him. My sister, this nervous, frightened, crushed, fettered creature, loved a man who was married and had children. I felt sorry for something, but what exactly I don't know. The presence of the doctor was for some reason distasteful to me now, and I could not imagine what would come of this love of theirs. Masha and I drove to Kurilovka to the dedication of the school. "Autumn, autumn, autumn," said Masha softly, looking away. "Summer is over. There are no birds and nothing is green but the willows." Yes, summer was over. There were fine, warm days, but it was fresh in the morning, and the shepherds went out in their sheepskins already. And in our garden the dew did not dry off the asters all day long. There were plaintive sounds all the time, and one could not make out whether they came from the shutters creaking on their rusty hinges or from the flying cranes, and one's heart felt light, and one was eager for life. "The summer is over," said Masha. "Now you and I can balance our accounts. We have done a lot of work, a lot of thinking. We are the better for it. All honor and glory to us. We have succeeded in self-improvement, but have our successes had any perceptible influence on the life around us? Have they brought any benefit to anyone whatever? No. Ignorance, physical uncleanliness, drunkenness, and appallingly high infant mortality, everything remains as it was, and no one is the better for your having ploughed and sown, and my having wasted money and read books. Obviously we have been working only for ourselves and have had advanced ideas only for ourselves." Such reasoning perplexed me, and I did not know what to think. "We have been sincere from beginning to end," said I, "and if anyone is sincere he is right. Who disputes it? We were right, but we haven't succeeded in properly accomplishing what we were right in. To begin with, our external methods themselves, aren't they mistaken? You want to be of use to men, but by the very fact of your buying an estate, from the very start you cut yourself off from any possibility of doing anything useful for them. Then if you work, dress, eat like a peasant, you sanctify, as it were, by your authority, their heavy, clumsy dress, their horrible huts, their stupid beards. On the other hand, if we suppose that you work for long, long years, your whole life, that in the end some practical results are obtained, yet what are they, your results? What can they do against such elemental forces as wholesale ignorance, hunger, cold, degeneration? A drop in the ocean! Other methods of struggle are needed, strong, bold, rapid. If one really wants to be of use one must get out of the narrow circle of ordinary social work and try to act direct upon the mass. What is wanted, first of all, is a loud, energetic propaganda. Why is it that art, music for instance, is so living, so popular, and in reality so powerful? Because the musician or the singer affects thousands at once. Precious, precious art," she went on, looking dreamily at the sky. "Art gives us wings and carries us far, far away. Anyone who is sick of filth, of petty, mercenary interests, anyone who is revolted, wounded, and indignant, can find peace and satisfaction only in the beautiful." When we drove into Kurilovka, the weather was bright and joyous. Somewhere they were threshing, there was a smell of rye straw. A mountain ash was bright red behind the hurdle fences, and all the trees, wherever one looked, were ruddy or golden. They were ringing the bells, they were carrying the icons to the school, and we could hear them sing, "Holy Mother, our Defender," and how limpid the air was, and how high the doves were flying. The service was being held in the classroom. Then the peasants of Kurilovka brought Masha the icon, and the peasants of Dubetchnya offered her a big loaf and a gilt salt cellar. And Masha broke into sobs. "If anything has been said that shouldn't have been, or anything done not to your liking, forgive us," said an old man, and he bowed down to her and to me. As we drove home Masha kept looking round at the school. The green roof, which I had painted, and which was glistening in the sun, remained in sight for a long while, and I felt that the look Masha turned upon it now was one of farewell. In the evening she got ready to go to the town. Of late she had taken to going often to the town and staying the night there. In her absence I could not work, my hands felt weak and limp, our huge courtyard seemed a dreary, repulsive, empty hole. The garden was full of angry noises, and without her the house, the trees, the horses were no longer ours. I did not go out of the house, but went on sitting at her table beside her bookshelf with the books on land work, those old favourites no longer wanted and looking at me now so shamefacedly. For whole hours together, while it struck 7, 8, 9, while the autumn night, black as soot, came on outside, I kept examining her old glove, or the pen with which she always wrote, or her little scissors. I did nothing, and realized clearly that all I had done before, ploughing, mowing, chopping, had only been because she wished it. And if she had sent me to clean a deep well, where I had to stand up to my waist in deep water, I should have crawled into the well without considering whether it was necessary or not. And now, when she was not near, Dubetchnya, with its ruins, its untidiness, its banging shutters, with its thieves by day and by night, seemed to me a chaos in which any work would be useless. Besides, what had I to work for here? Why anxiety and thought about the future if I felt that the earth was giving way under my feet, that I had played my part in Dubetchnya, and that the fate of the books on farming was awaiting me too? Ah, what misery it was at night, in hours of solitude, when I was listening every minute in alarm, as though I were expecting someone to shout that it was time for me to go away. I did not grieve for Dubetchnya, I grieved for my love, which too was threatened with its autumn. What an immense happiness it is to love and be loved, and how awful to feel that one is slipping down from that high pinnacle. Masha returned from the town towards the evening of the next day. She was displeased with something, but she concealed it, and only said why was it all the window frames had been put in for the winter, it was enough to suffocate one. I took out 2 frames. We were not hungry, but we sat down to supper. "Go and wash your hands," said my wife. "You smell of putty." She had brought some new illustrated papers from the town, and we looked at them together after supper. There were supplements with fashion plates and patterns. Masha looked through them casually and was putting them aside to examine them properly later on, but one dress with a flat skirt as full as a bell and large sleeves interested her, and she looked at it for a minute gravely and attentively. "That's not bad," she said. "Yes, that dress would suit you beautifully," I said, "beautifully." And looking with emotion at the dress, admiring that patch of grey simply because she liked it, I went on tenderly: "A charming, exquisite dress, splendid, glorious, Masha, my precious Masha," and tears dropped on the fashion plate. "Splendid, Masha," I muttered. "Sweet, precious Masha." She went to bed, while I sat another hour looking at the illustrations. "It's a pity you took out the window frames," she said from the bedroom. "I'm afraid I may be cold. Oh dear, what a draught there is!" I read something out of the column of odds and ends, a receipt for making cheap ink, and an account of the biggest diamond in the world. I came again upon the fashion plate of the dress she liked, and I imagined her at a ball, with a fan, bare shoulders, brilliant, splendid, with a full understanding of painting, music, literature, and how small and how brief my part seemed. Our meeting, our marriage, had been only one of the episodes of which there would be many more in the life of this vital, richly gifted woman. All the best in the world, as I have said already, was at her service, and she received it absolutely for nothing, and even ideas and the intellectual movement in vogue served simply for her recreation, giving variety to her life, and I was only the sledge driver who drove her from one entertainment to another. Now she did not need me. She would take flight, and I should be alone. And as though in response to my thought, there came a despairing scream from the garden. "Help!" It was a shrill, womanish voice, and as though to mimic it, the wind whistled in the chimney on the same shrill note. Half a minute passed, and again, through the noise of the wind, but coming, it seemed, from the other end of the yard, "Help!" "Misail, do you hear?" my wife asked me softly. "Do you hear?" She came out from the bedroom in her nightgown, with her hair down, and listened, looking at the dark window. "Someone is being murdered," she said. "That is the last straw." I took my gun and went out. It was very dark outside, the wind was high, and it was difficult to stand. I went to the gate and listened. The trees roared, the wind whistled, and, probably at the feeble-minded peasants, a dog howled lazily. Outside the gates the darkness was absolute, not a light on the railway line, and near the lodge, which a year before had been the office, suddenly sounded a smothered scream. "Help!" "Who's there?" I called. There were two people struggling. One was thrusting the other out, while the other was resisting, and both were breathing heavily. "Leave go!" said one, and I recognized Ivan Cheprakov. It was he who was shrieking in a shrill womanish voice. "Let go, you damned brute, or I'll bite your hand off!" The other I recognized as Moisey. I separated them, and as I did so I could not resist hitting Moisey 2 blows in the face. He fell down, then got up again, and I hit him once more. "He tried to kill me," he muttered. "He was trying to get at his mamma's chest. I want to lock him up in the lodge for security." Cheprakov was drunk and did not recognize me. He kept drawing deep breaths, as though he were just going to shout help again. I left them and went back to the house. My wife was lying on her bed. She was dressed. I told her what had happened in the yard, and did not conceal the fact that I had hit Moisey. "It's terrible to live in the country," she said. "And what a long night it is. Oh dear, if only it were over." "Help!" we heard again a little later. "I'll go and stop them," I said. "No, let them bite each other's throats," she said with an expression of disgust. She was looking up at the ceiling, listening, while I sat beside her, not daring to speak to her, feeling as though I were to blame for their shouting help in the yard, and for the nights seeming so long. We were silent, and I waited impatiently for a gleam of light at the window, and Masha looked all the time as though she had awakened from a trance, and now was marvelling how she, so clever and well educated, so elegant, had come into this pitiful, provincial, empty hole among a crew of petty, insignificant people, and how she could have so far forgotten herself as ever to be attracted by one of these people, and for more than 6 months to have been his wife. It seemed to me that at that moment it did not matter to her whether it was I, or Moisey, or Cheprakov. Everything for her was merged in that savage, drunken help. I and our marriage and our work together, and the mud and slush of autumn. And when she sighed or moved into a more comfortable position, I read in her face, "Oh, that morning would come quickly." In the morning she went away. I spent another 3 days at Dubetchnya expecting her, then I packed all our things in one room, locked it, and walked to the town. It was already evening when I rang at the engineer's, and the street lamps were burning in Great Dvoryansky Street. Pavel told me there was no one at home. Viktor Ivanitch had gone to Petersburg, and Maria Viktorovna was probably at the rehearsal at the Azhogins'. I remember with what emotion I went on to the Azhogins', how my heart throbbed and fluttered as I mounted the stairs and stood waiting a long while on the landing at the top, not daring to enter the temple of the muses. In the big room there were lighted candles everywhere, on a little table, on the piano, and on the stage everywhere in threes, and the first performance was fixed for the 13th, and now the first rehearsal was on a Monday, an unlucky day. All part of the war against superstition. All the devotees of the scenic art were gathered together. The eldest, the middle, and the youngest sisters were walking about the stage, reading their parts in exercise books. Apart from all the rest stood Radish, motionless, with the side of his head pressed to the wall, as he gazed with adoration at the stage, waiting for the rehearsal to begin. Everything as it used to be. I was making my way to my hostess. I had to pay my respects to her, but suddenly everyone said "Hush!" and waved me to step quietly. There was a silence. The lid of the piano was raised, a lady sat down at it, screwing up her short-sighted eyes at the music, and my Masha walked up to the piano, in a low-necked dress, looking beautiful, but with a special new sort of beauty, not in the least like the Masha who used to come and meet me in the spring at the mill. She sang "Why Do I Love the Radiant Night?" It was the first time during our whole acquaintance that I had heard her sing. She had a fine, mellow, powerful voice, and while she sang I felt as though I were eating a ripe, sweet, fragrant melon. She ended, the audience applauded, and she smiled, very much pleased, making play with her eyes, turning over the music, smoothing her skirts like a bird that has at last broken out of its cage and preens its wings in freedom. Her hair was arranged over her ears, and she had an unpleasant, defiant expression in her face, as though she wanted to throw down a challenge to us all, or to shout to us, as she did to her horses, "Hey there, my beauties!" And she must at that moment have been very much like her grandfather, the sledge driver. "You here too?" she said, giving me her hand. "Did you hear me sing? Well, what did you think of it?" And without waiting for my answer she went on, "It's a very good thing you are here. I am going tonight to Petersburg for a short time. You'll let me go, won't you?" At midnight I went with her to the station. She embraced me affectionately, probably feeling grateful to me for not asking unnecessary questions, and she promised to write to me, and I held her hands a long time and kissed them, hardly able to restrain my tears, and not uttering a word. And when she had gone I stood watching the retreating lights, caressing her in imagination, and softly murmuring, "My darling Masha, glorious Masha." I spent the night at Karpovna's, and next morning I was at work with Radish, recovering the furniture of a rich merchant who was marrying his daughter to a doctor. My sister came after dinner on Sunday and had tea with me. "I read a great deal now," she said, showing me the books which she had fetched from the public library on her way to me. "Thanks to your wife and to Vladimir, they have awakened me to self-realization. They have been my salvation. They have made me feel myself a human being. In old days I used to lie awake at night with worries of all sorts, thinking what a lot of sugar we had used in the week, or hoping the cucumbers would not be too salt. And now, too, I lie awake at night, but I have different thoughts. I am distressed that half my life has been passed in such a foolish, cowardly way. I despise my past. I am ashamed of it. And I look upon our father now as my enemy. Oh, how grateful I am to your wife and Vladimir! He is such a wonderful person. They have opened my eyes." "That's bad that you don't sleep at night," I said. "Do you think I am ill? Not at all. Vladimir sounded me and said I was perfectly well. But health is not what matters. It is not so important. Tell me, am I right?" She needed moral support, that was obvious. Masha had gone away, Dr. Blagovo was in Petersburg, and there was no one left in the town but me to tell her she was right. She looked intently into my face, trying to read my secret thoughts, and if I were absorbed or silent in her presence she thought it was on her account, and was grieved. I always had to be on my guard, and when she asked me whether she was right, I hastened to assure her that she was right, and that I had a deep respect for her. "Do you know they have given me a part at the Azhogins'?" she went on. "I want to act on the stage. I want to live. In fact, I mean to drain the full cup. I have no talent, none, and the part is only 10 lines, but still this is immeasurably finer and loftier than pouring out tea 5 times a day and looking to see if the cook has eaten too much. Above all, let my father see I am capable of protest." After tea she lay down on my bed and lay for a little while with her eyes closed, looking very pale. "What weakness!" she said, getting up. "Vladimir says all city-bred women and girls are anemic from doing nothing. What a clever man Vladimir is! He is right, absolutely right. We must work." 2 days later she came to the Azhogins' with her manuscript for the rehearsal. She was wearing a black dress with a string of coral round her neck and a brooch that in the distance was like a pastry puff, and in her ears earrings sparkling with brilliants. When I looked at her I felt uncomfortable. I was struck by her lack of taste. That she had very inappropriately put on earrings and brilliants, and that she was strangely dressed, was remarked by other people too. I saw smiles on people's faces, and heard someone say with a laugh, "Cleopatra of Egypt." She was trying to assume society manners, to be unconstrained and at her ease, and so seemed artificial and strange. She had lost simplicity and sweetness. "I told father just now that I was going to the rehearsal," she began, coming up to me, "and he shouted that he would not give me his blessing, and actually almost struck me. Only fancy, I don't know my part," she said, looking at her manuscript. "I am sure to make a mess of it. So be it, the die is cast," she went on in intense excitement. "The die is cast." It seemed to her that everyone was looking at her, and that all were amazed at the momentous step she had taken, that everyone was expecting something special of her, and it would have been impossible to convince her that no one was paying attention to people so petty and insignificant as she and I were. She had nothing to do till the 3rd act, and her part, that of a visitor, a provincial crony, consisted only in standing at the door as though listening, and then delivering a brief monologue. In the interval before her appearance, an hour and a half at least, while they were moving about on the stage reading their parts, drinking tea and arguing, she did not leave my side, and was all the time muttering her part and nervously crumpling up the manuscript. And imagining that everyone was looking at her, and waiting for her appearance, with a trembling head she smoothed back her hair, and said to me, "I shall certainly make a mess of it. What a load on my heart, if only you knew. I feel frightened, as though I were just going to be led to execution." At last her turn came. "Kleopatra Alexeyevna, it's your cue," said the stage manager. She came forward into the middle of the stage with an expression of horror on her face, looking ugly and angular, and for half a minute stood as though in a trance, perfectly motionless, and only her big earrings shook in her ears. "The first time you can read it," said someone. It was clear to me that she was trembling, and trembling so much that she could not speak and could not unfold her manuscript, and that she was incapable of acting her part, and I was already on the point of going to her and saying something, when she suddenly dropped on her knees in the middle of the stage and broke into loud sobs. All was commotion and hubbub. I alone stood still, leaning against the side scene, overwhelmed by what had happened, not understanding and not knowing what to do. I saw them lift her up and lead her away. I saw Anyuta Blagovo come up to me. I had not seen her in the room before, and she seemed to have sprung out of the earth. She was wearing her hat and veil, and, as always, had an air of having come only for a moment. "I told her not to take a part," she said angrily, jerking out each word abruptly and turning crimson. "It's insanity. You ought to have prevented her." Madame Azhogin, in a short jacket with short sleeves, with cigarette ash on her breast, looking thin and flat, came rapidly towards me. "My dear, this is terrible," she brought out, wringing her hands, and, as her habit was, looking intently into my face. "This is terrible. Your sister is in a condition. She is with child. Take her away, I implore you." She was breathless with agitation, while on one side stood her three daughters exactly like her, thin and flat, huddling together in a scared way. They were alarmed, overwhelmed, as though a convict had been caught in their house. What a disgrace! How dreadful! And yet this estimable family had spent its life waging war on superstition. Evidently they imagined that all the superstition and error of humanity was limited to the 3 candles, the 13th of the month, and to the unluckiness of Monday. "I beg you, I beg," repeated Madame Azhogin, pursing up her lips in the shape of a heart on the syllable U. "I beg you to take her home." A little later my sister and I were walking along the street. I covered her with the skirts of my coat. We hastened, choosing back streets where there were no street lamps, avoiding passers by. It was as though we were running away. She was no longer crying, but looked at me with dry eyes. To Karpovna's, where I took her, it was only 20 minutes' walk, and, strange to say, in that short time we succeeded in thinking of our whole life. We talked over everything, considered our position, reflected. We decided we could not go on living in this town, and that when I had earned a little money we would move to some other place. In some houses everyone was asleep, in others they were playing cards. We hated these houses. We were afraid of them. We talked of the fanaticism, the coarseness of feeling, the insignificance of these respectable families, these amateurs of dramatic art whom we had so alarmed, and I kept asking in what way these stupid, cruel, lazy and dishonest people were superior to the drunken and superstitious peasants of Kurilovka, or in what way they were better than animals, who in the same way are thrown into a panic when some incident disturbs the monotony of their life limited by their instincts. What would have happened to my sister now if she had been left to live at home? What moral agonies would she have experienced talking with my father, meeting every day with acquaintances? I imagined this to myself, and at once there came into my mind people, all people I knew, who had been slowly done to death by their nearest relations. I remembered the tortured dogs driven mad, the live sparrows plucked naked by boys and flung into the water, and a long, long series of obscure lingering miseries which I had looked on continually from early childhood in that town, and I could not understand what these 60,000 people lived for, what they read the Gospel for, why they prayed, why they read books and magazines. What good had they gained from all that had been said and written hitherto if they were still possessed by the same spiritual darkness and hatred of liberty as they were 100 and 300 years ago? A master carpenter spends his whole life building houses in the town, and always, to the day of his death, calls a gallery a galdery. So these 60,000 people have been reading and hearing of truth, of justice, of mercy, of freedom for generations, and yet from morning till night, till the day of their death, they are lying and tormenting each other, and they fear liberty and hate it as a deadly foe. "And so my fate is decided," said my sister as we arrived home. "After what has happened, I cannot go back there. Heavens, how good that is! My heart feels lighter." She went to bed at once. Tears were glittering on her eyelashes, but her expression was happy. She fell into a sound, sweet sleep, and one could see that her heart was lighter and that she was resting. It was a long, long time since she had slept like that. And so we began our life together. She was always singing and saying that her life was very happy, and the books I brought her from the public library I took back unread, as now she could not read. She wanted to do nothing but dream and talk of the future, mending my linen or helping Karpovna near the stove. She was always singing or talking of her Vladimir, of his cleverness, of his charming manners, of his kindness, of his extraordinary learning, and I assented to all she said, though by now I disliked her doctor. She wanted to work, to lead an independent life on her own account, and she used to say that she would become a school teacher or a doctor's assistant as soon as her health would permit her, and would herself do the scrubbing and the washing. Already she was passionately devoted to her child. He was not yet born, but she knew already the colour of his eyes, what his hands would be like, and how he would laugh. She was fond of talking about education, and as her Vladimir was the best man in the world, all her discussion of education could be summed up in the question how to make the boy as fascinating as his father. There was no end to her talk, and everything she said made her intensely joyful. Sometimes I was delighted too, though I could not have said why. I suppose her dreaminess infected me. I too gave up reading and did nothing but dream. In the evenings, in spite of my fatigue, I walked up and down the room with my hands in my pockets talking of Masha. "What do you think?" I would ask my sister. "When will she come back? I think she'll come back at Christmas, not later. What has she to do there?" "As she doesn't write to you, it's evident she will come back very soon." "That's true," I assented, though I knew perfectly well that Masha would not return to our town. I missed her fearfully, and could no longer deceive myself, and tried to get other people to deceive me. My sister was expecting her doctor, and I Masha, and both of us talked incessantly, laughed, and did not notice that we were preventing Karpovna from sleeping. She lay on the stove and kept muttering. "The samovar hummed this morning, it did hum. Oh, it bodes no good, my dears, it bodes no good." No one ever came to see us but the postman, who brought my sister letters from the doctor, and Prokofy, who sometimes came in to see us in the evening, and after looking at my sister without speaking, went away, and when he was in the kitchen said: "Every class ought to remember its rules, and anyone who is so proud that he won't understand that will find it a vale of tears." He was very fond of the phrase "a vale of tears." One day, it was in Christmas week, when I was walking by the bazaar. He called me into the butcher's shop, and not shaking hands with me, announced that he had to speak to me about something very important. His face was red from the frost and vodka. Near him, behind the counter, stood Nikolka, with the expression of a brigand, holding a blood-stained knife in his hand. "I desire to express my word to you," Prokofy began. "This incident cannot continue, because, as you understand yourself, that for such a veil people will say nothing good of you or of us. Mamma, through pity, cannot say something unpleasant to you, that your sister should move into another lodging on account of her condition, but I won't have it any more, because I can't approve of her behaviour." I understood him, and I went out of the shop. The same day my sister and I moved to Radish's. We had no money for a cab, and we walked on foot. I carried a parcel of our belongings on my back. My sister had nothing in her hands, but she gasped for breath and coughed, and kept asking whether we should get there soon. End of section 7.